1 year ago, Hollyland launched the Lark M2 wireless microphone system, offering high-quality audio with a transmitter that is barely noticeable. But apparently it was still too noticeable for some users, so Hollyland have now launched this, the new Lark M2S, with a radical new transmitter design that makes it even more discreet. So naturally I had to get my hands on this new system in order to check it out. Yes, purchase with my own money of course, so let's do an honest and unbiased first impressions review of the new Hollyland Lark M2S. When a company launches a new product after 1 year, you typically expect it to have new features, capabilities, and upgraded specifications compared to the previous model. But that's not the case with the Lark M2S. The key focus of this system is the newly redesigned transmitter, which as you can see makes it even more discreet to wear than the original M2. It also makes it easier to use and less likely to become detached. And in fact, in order to complete this redesign, Hollyland have had to make a couple of specification compromises compared to the M2, and obviously we'll cover those in this video. But most importantly, of course, we want to make sure there are no compromises in the audio quality, range, or stability, so of course we're going to be testing this against the M2 to see how it compares. So that means there's a lot to cover, so as usual I'll place the chapters up here and on the video timeline. But before we get into it, the usual disclaimer: this video is not sponsored, paid for, or influenced in any way. I purchased all of the equipment with my own money and the opinions are entirely my own. And of course, if you enjoy our video today, please remember to give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more similar content. So let's get on with it. So when it comes to the differences between the M2S and the original M2, the most significant change is, of course, in these, the transmitters. Now, in the case of the M2, Hollyland went for this very simple disc design, which weighs in at just 8 grams without the magnet, although you do need to add some kind of magnet in order to wear this. In the case of the M2S, we now have this clip type design, where in the smaller end of the clip you have basically just the microphone elements, and in the larger lobe on the other end of the clip you have basically everything else. You've got the battery, you've got the processor, the transmitter components, and so on. The idea being this hides behind your clothing. And incredibly, this weighs even less than the M2, coming in at just 7 grams, and of course there's nothing to add in the case of the M2S transmitter. As far as wearing the M2 transmitter is concerned, basically I'm going to use this magnet, which I place inside my shirt and then clip it on. It's pretty straightforward. Maybe I have to adjust it a little bit. And once it's in place, as you can see, the microphone is pretty discreet. Hollyland does provide some stickers, including a black sticker which can cover up the logo, but I do find it a little annoying that you always have this LED indicator light flashing and it cannot be turned off. Now the magnet is pretty secure, and as long as I'm standing or just walking around it should stay firmly in place, but if I'm running or doing anything energetic, there's always a danger that this can come off. And because these transmitters are so tiny, there's always a danger that I may not even notice until it's too late. Now, when I first saw the design of the M2S transmitter online, in all honesty, I was a little bit skeptical, but having played around with this for a couple of days now, I actually find I really like it. It's very simple to mount. It's pretty much as discreet as a microphone gets. I would say perhaps even more discreet than a wired lavalier microphone. And I would say no matter what you're doing, it would be pretty difficult for this to come off. Another big improvement on the M2S transmitter is the implementation of the windshield. Now, in the case of the M2, frankly, this was nothing short of a disaster. The idea being to place the entire transmitter into this giant windshield, no easy task in itself, and by the time you're done, you end up with this giant creature adorning the front of your shirt. Well, with the M2S, that has definitely been improved. It's still not as slick as DJI's solution, but it is pretty good. Basically, you have a rubber sleeve on the back of the wind protector. I find it's easiest to try to squeeze it to open it up slightly and then just slide it onto the microphone end. Obviously, it's no longer quite as discreet, but then again, once you have one of these wind protectors in place, it really is. Now, there is one negative change for the M2S. In order to keep the weight down, they have actually reduced the size of the battery, which reduces the total runtime going from 10 hours on the M2 to just 9 hours on the M2S. But to be honest, I can't imagine this being an issue for anybody. So let's move on to the receivers. Now you can see the M2S receiver has had a redesign, and frankly I think it is a positive one. I think the receiver, just like all the components of the M2S, have a better style to them and a more quality look and feel. As far as functionality is concerned, they've changed the design of the dial for adjusting the gain. On the M2S, it is more recessed and the click stops are more firm. I found on the M2 it was a little bit loose and a bit too easy to change it by accident. They've also reduced the number of buttons from 2 buttons on the M2 to just a single button on the M2S, but all the functionality is the same on both receivers. Now, I think the most significant change on the receiver is that they've done away with the spring clip. The M2 had one of these spring clips. Personally, I never used this, but maybe this is going to be missed by some users. But in its place, we now have a fixed and perfectly square and symmetrical cold shoe. That means that unlike the M2 receiver, which could only be mounted in one direction on the cold shoe, with the status lights facing the back of the camera, the M2S receiver can be mounted in any orientation, with the status lights facing the front, the back, or even one of the sides. So basically a very simple change, but one which gives you a lot more flexibility in mounting the receiver. And finally, let's turn our attention to the full systems in their charging cases. Now here again, you can clearly see the design change going from the M2 to the M2S charging cases. And while the design and build quality, I would say, are not quite up to the standard of something like DJI, you could see it's definitely a step in the right direction. Now the M2S case is slightly taller than the M2, but overall they are about the same size, and the M2S case is also a little bit lighter than the M2. Now that has been achieved in part also by sacrificing the battery in the M2S case. The M2S has a smaller battery which can only charge the components 2 times over versus 3 times over on the original M2. Although frankly, unless you're going to be filming in some very remote location, I don't see this being a major issue to most users. Now, what makes that weight loss even more impressive, if we take a look inside, you can see that the M2S case now makes room also for the USB receiver, so you do not have to pack that separately. Although, to be honest, I would have preferred they make room for the 3.5mm TRS cable and the wind protector rather than the USB receiver. So in order to carry around these extra items, you still have to pack everything up into the included drawstring bag, which, in spite of the upgraded quality of the other components, is the same one as is supplied with the M2. So, as we've discussed, the only real difference between the M2S system and the M2 system is the design. When it comes to the features, capabilities, and the audio specifications, both systems are basically identical. So when it comes to the final audio quality, they should both sound the same, right? Well, let's find out. So let's start our audio tests indoors. Currently I'm using a Sony ZV-1, and the microphone you're currently listening to me on is a Rode Video Mic Go 2 suspended just up here out of camera shot. Now there is no special audio treatment in this room, but I find this gives a pretty decent overall audio quality. That changes, however, if I move away from the camera. If I turn away from the camera, obviously my voice begins to fade. And that is, of course, where our wireless mic comes in. So let's switch over to the Lark M2S and see how it compares. And now I have switched over to the Lark M2S. So how is the audio quality using the M2S? How does it compare to the shotgun microphone? Of course, being a wireless microphone means I can now move away from the camera. I can turn away from the camera and you will have no problem continuing to hear my voice. But perhaps most importantly, how does the M2S compare to the M2? Well, let's remind ourselves of how the M2 performed in this same test. And now I have switched over to the other wireless microphone. We'll call it microphone B. How is the audio quality now on microphone B? How does it compare to microphone A or the shotgun microphone? Okay, so what did you think? How did the audio quality of the M2S and M2 compare? Now let's take this outside and do some additional testing. Okay, and now let's continue our audio test outside. I have switched cameras. I now have the M2S receiver connected to a Panasonic Lumix G9, and this is the audio quality using the M2S transmitter. So let's just remind ourselves of how the M2 sounded using this exact same configuration. And now I have switched over to microphone B. So how does microphone B sound in our basic outdoor audio test? How does it compare to microphone A or the shotgun microphone? Okay, and now switching back to the M2S. So how does the audio quality compare between the two? But what about range and stability? Let's go ahead and test that out also. So I'm going to take a walk. So now I'm around about 50 feet away from the camera. There is a little bit of background noise. There's a plane flying over and a few birds you may be able to hear in the background. But how is the audio quality here at 50 feet from the camera? How about if I turn away and turn my back from the camera? Are you noticing any signal interruptions? Are you still able to hear my voice clearly? And once again, let's remind ourselves of how the M2 performed in this test. And now at 50 feet using microphone B, how does this compare to microphone A? Are you noticing any difference in the audio quality or signal stability? How about if I turn away from the camera, turn my back to the camera? Are you noticing any issues at all? Are you still able to hear my voice without any interruptions? Okay, so much for 50 feet. Let's take this a little bit further up to 100 feet and see how it performs there. And now at 100 feet away from the camera using the M2S. How is the audio quality? Is there any deterioration in the signal? How about if I turn away, turn my back to the camera? Are you still able to hear me okay? Are you noticing any signal interruptions? And of course, once again, let's compare this to how the M2 performed. And now 100 feet using microphone B. How does this compare? How is the audio quality? How is the signal stability? Let's once again turn away and turn my back to the camera. Are you still able to hear me okay? Are you noticing any signal interruptions? Okay, that was the M2. Now I've switched back over to the M2S. Let's do one last test at 150 feet to see how well it performs. And for our final test, we are now 150 feet away from the camera, still using the M2S microphone. How is the audio quality? Let's do our obstruction test. Turning my back to the camera. Are you still able to hear me okay? Are you noticing any drops in the signal? And of course, once again, let's compare this to the performance of the M2. And 150 feet now using microphone B. How is the audio quality and signal stability? Are you able to hear me okay? How does it compare to microphone A? How does that change if I turn away and turn my back to the camera? Are you still able to hear me okay? Are you noticing any interruptions? And switching back once more to the M2S. So what do you think? How did the audio quality compare between the two? So that was pretty surprising. I really did not expect there to be quite so much difference in the audio quality between the two systems. Now, I've listened to these clips several times over now, over speakers and over headphones, and for me, what I hear is that the M2S has a fuller sound with deeper basses, but it also has a somewhat muffled, almost artificial sound to the voice. Now, as I mentioned in the captions, I did wonder if perhaps I had noise cancelling turned on by accident, but I went back and double checked and that was not the case. In fact, I'm talking to you right now over the M2S. Let's go ahead and turn on noise cancellation. So now noise cancellation is enabled. So this is the sound of the M2S with the noise cancellation turned on. Let's go ahead and turn it back off again. And now I'm talking to you with noise cancellation turned back off again. So overall, I'm a little bit torn here. As I said, I think the M2S has a fuller, richer sound, but I do think that the M2 sounded a little bit more natural. But what did you think? What did you hear during the audio test? Please go ahead and put that into the comments section. So what is the verdict on the new Hollyland Lark M2S system? So overall, when it comes to the design, which I think is the main focus of the M2S system, I think most users are going to prefer this design over the magnet system of the M2. It's easier to work with, it's more discreet, and if you're running, biking, or doing any kind of action activity, it's far less likely to come off. As for the sound quality, again, I'm a little bit on the fence here. I think it comes down to personal preference, but again, let me know what you think. So that wraps it up for another video. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please remember to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more similar content. If you have any comments, any questions, suggestions for future videos, please drop those into the comment section. Otherwise, thanks for watching.